All right, so this week on our little adventures through the history of TV, this one has kind of been a long time coming. It's just been waiting in the wings the whole time. Is that, I was born in 79, so most of my pop culture knowledge is from the late 80s and just the 90s in general, because that's when I was a teenager. And if I ever know about something from before then, something that it seems like would have no reason to know about, but I just mysteriously do, 99 times out of 100, it's because it was on The Simpsons. That's come up so many times on this podcast. Like, oh yeah, I saw that in The Simpsons. Most recently, 2 weeks ago, we did All in the Family. And I was like, oh yeah, first time I ever heard of that was Homer and Marge sitting at the piano, All in the Family opening. So I was like, you know what? We've had some rocky times lately, some shows, some real ups and downs lately in these shows we've been watching. So I was like, this week, let's just fucking watch The Simpsons. Like,
Sure.
It's obviously been coming. Like, it's like, I think of it as like a cultural like kaleidoscope or a prism. It's like by watching The Simpsons, the light refracted out and it made me aware of like 70 other things. Like the cultural impact it had on my generation is like crazy.
The Simpsons is a classic, and what amazes me about it is I always presumed the writers of The Simpsons when it first started were people who would have been, well, I guess maybe they were in their 30s and 40s at that time. They were about my age, actually. So they must be about my age now. The references that they make are way back, they go back to the 50s and the 60s, earlier than that, some of it. But especially the 60s and the 70s, a lot of references to that, which makes sense because, yeah, that's how old those writers were at the time. They would have been in their 20s or 30s, maybe 40s. But that's why, for my generation, oh yeah, they are, as soon as we see that stuff, we say, oh yeah, man, I know that stuff. I was there.
Yeah, it's one of those things like I wasn't as aware of initially, but it became clear later, is like even though Marge and Homer were parents in the 90s, they were really parents in the 60s and 70s because all these writers were basing it on their own parents.
On their own parents, yeah.
Because
exactly.
Like Marge's whole vibe is very 50s housewife, and even just the way their house is decorated and the kitschy kind of feel of it. And like Homer, there's an episode where the kids go to see Spinal Tap, but Homer just waits in the car and he's singing along to that. It was a little Spanish flea, da, 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 da. Like this song that is not contemporary, even in the 90s.
And the grandfather.
Yeah.
He's World War II.
Right.
Or Korean War. He's definitely...
Every war.
Yeah, every war. But particularly Korea, World War II, which would only been about 6 years before. The ending of World War II was 6 years before the Korean War. Yeah, he was one of those American vets that was in those wars.
Yeah, so that is one interesting thing about The Simpsons, is I would say, specifically with The Simpsons, because it's still going to this day. It's in season like 30-something. I don't know. I haven't watched it in years. It's a very bad show now. I'll get into that a bit after. But basically, it's, different people have different delineation points of what the golden age of The Simpsons was, but I feel like the easy way to say it is just the 90s, because the first episode was December 1989. So by episode 2, it was the 90s, and for the whole 90s, it was really good, and then at some point in there, it got bad, but it's just safe to say the first 10 years was good.
And remember how I made comments about All in the Family, that some people that I knew personally didn't get it. Like, they didn't get the whole Archie Bunker giving the message of what life was like at that time. The same thing happened with The Simpsons, because when The Simpsons first came on, I had women friends who had kids who were 10, 11, 12 years old watching that, and they were just appalled that they couldn't let them watch it because that Bart Simpson, such a bad influence.
Yeah.
And they didn't get it. Like, they didn't get the whole idea of the whole picture of what that family was and what it was representing at that time. So...
Yeah, one thing I thought was interesting, because, it was a big furor initially that, Bart Simpson, the bad boy of TV, how can you let your kids watch this? And it was just because they would do these kind of weird, jokes about, like, him using the word damn, or, like, his dog gets a girlfriend at one point, and he's like, man, my dog hasn't been the same since his bitch came around. And Marge is like, Bart, don't say that. And he's like, what? That's the word. And, I looked it up, and Marge is like, I'm going to have to write the dictionary people about that. Like they would find ways for Bart to swear. I think that's really literally the only reason people were upset about it, is because it was a cartoon and it had light swearing, which is like crazy.
And it had the messages that he always had to write on the board at the beginning of each show.
Yeah.
Were always a little suspect.
But yeah, at the end of the day, he's just Dennis the Menace. It's really not that big a deal.
Yeah.
Whereas on the other side of the coin, yeah, it's interesting that The Simpsons was the only show at the time, and kind of still now, where their pastor is a regular character, and they go to church every week, and they know the people in the neighborhood, and it's a whole town. There's a guy from India that lives there. There's like all this stuff that was really progressive at the time. Although I guess the guy from India thing is a little weird because they had a white guy doing the accent. So, it wasn't all, but like the church thing is a good example. It's like, yeah, he says damn, but who else is going to church? Flanders is nothing but the nicest man in the world, and he's the religious next door neighbor. Like, if anything, I feel like the people who were upset about The Simpsons had a lot of reason to like the show The Simpsons if they had ever watched it.
That's the key right there. If they had actually sat down and watched it, and not just watched one show, watched 2 or 3 at least before they passed judgment. But there was a big hoopla in like magazines at the time, and and it was, I won't let my child watch that.
Right.
Well, okay, whatever.
So yeah, basically early Simpsons in a nutshell. I mean, I could do easily an entire podcast about The Simpsons. Like we could do for each episode of The Simpsons, like the research I do for entire shows, you could do that for each episode of early Simpsons.
You love The Simpsons.
But it really is like legitimately you could, because there's so many layers and so many references and so much going on. It's like not a flat show, not a thin show. I don't know how to describe it.
No, that's a perfect description. No, it is not a thin show.
But basically what I believe happened is because of that it was a Fox show. So at the time, Fox was a new network, and their only hit up to this point was Married with Children. So The Simpsons was somewhat in that vein of like, let's push the envelope a little, let's do the things that the other networks won't do. But it was also the first primetime animated show since the Flintstones, I believe. So it had been a long time since cartoons had been, not Saturday morning stuff. And they got that initial, because the first season of The Simpsons was a half year, and it wasn't that great, but they got all that furor and all that media attention, and kids loved it. And basically it seems like the writers of The Simpsons, who were all these like fancy pants, smarty pants people, they were like, this is our opportunity. We've got this chance that everyone is paying attention to this show. This is our chance to really say something and do something good. And yeah, they just busted their balls. Like when you hear about the old school Simpsons writing room, it's fucking crazy. The hours they worked, they just never went home. They stayed there all day. If there was a joke that made them laugh 30 times, but the 31st time it's like, they would replace it. Like it sounded insane. Like when I read about these stories about old Simpsons, it's like I could not hang there. Like a lot of times this is maybe like an arrogant way of looking at things, but sometimes when I watch TV shows, I think like, could I do that? And if it's a bad show, of course, I'm like, yeah, well, I could easily do that. And then if there's like a good show, like say Buffy, I'm like, well, what I would do would be different, but maybe I could hit that ballpark. I could do something somewhat like that. Where with The Simpsons, I feel like that golden age of The Simpsons, I can't even... If I wrote a Simpsons script, it would be embarrassing compared to what they did. It would be so much worse. And I just, like, again, it's an arrogant way to look at it, but I don't feel like that very often. But The Simpsons is just like it just gets better with age, and the more you look into it, the older I got when I learned who all these people were and what all these references were, like I'm like, holy shit, like there was more than I even realized going on in this show.
I know, and they keep coming at you with it. Yeah. It's not just 1 or 2 references in each show. They really lay it right out, like and continually from start to finish in each of those shows. Like they're excellent. They just keep coming at you with these references, and I'm sure that most people miss them. I know I miss a whole lot of them.
Yeah.
And it's only later you watch them a second and a third time, and you say, "Oh man, like I didn't get that." Oh yeah, that's referring to that. Oh yeah, wait a minute, now they're referring to something else.
That's like the one example I think of a lot is when I was like 16 or 17, somebody recommended Atlas Shrugged to me, the big famous Ayn Rand philosophy book. And I had thought, like, well, where'd this come from? I never heard of this. And then I realized, oh, yeah, I did. It was on The Simpsons. It was like they put Maggie in a daycare, and it's the Ayn Rand School for Tots, because Ayn Rand was such a hard ass, like, you cannot, you cannot accept society's help. You must be an individual. So it's, of course, absurd to make that, apply that to a baby. So I'm like, damn, man, I did know about that because of The Simpsons. Like, it's not even just that The Simpsons taught me about old TV shows and old movies. It taught me about old everything. It's ridiculous.
Yes. Old politics, old, everything. I mean, you get that, as I mentioned, the grandfather there, and when he talks about big battles in World War II, big American battles. Not just Pearl Harbor, he's got Midway and Guadalcanal and all this stuff that he
Well, then if you want to go back even further, Mr. Burns is always referencing fucking, pike helmets in 1910 wars and stuff, because he's really old.
Yeah, true enough.
But yeah, basically, as I understand it, I'm sure there's some Simpsons nerds that could correct me on this, but the guy who created The Simpsons, his name's Matt Groening, and he had a comic, like an alternative comic strip that he drew in like these like smaller newspapers and stuff, sort of alternative, called Life in Hell, that was about, it was a little weird. It was like this one-eared bunny and just weird gag comic, but it was like pretty avant-garde and stuff. So he got offered to make an animated show. At first, it was just these little bits they put in. There was a sketch show called The Tracy Ullman Show, and they asked him if he would do little cartoons for that. But he was afraid, because Life in Hell was his thing, he didn't want to sign that over. So he made up, apparently, as the story goes, on the spot, he made up The Simpsons, because like Homer's his dad's name, Lisa's his sister's name. The only difference is he's Bart. Bart is not named Matt. But so he just made up this family, weird design. I don't know if the yellow skin was his idea, but, just real weird design. But so he got the ball rolling, but you can't really give him the credit for what The Simpsons was, because his ideas were very weird. Like, he apparently pitched that, Marge has the long hair, that at some point they could reveal that underneath Marge's long hair, she had bunny ears. Like, just,
oh my God,
very strange stuff. So he got the ball rolling.
That long hair is Bride of Frankenstein.
Probably, yeah. Or again, just...
I mean, it doesn't have the white here in the corners, but that cone head, that's Bride of Frankenstein's head.
And even just in general, her like pearl necklace and the hair, and like it's just kind of like 50s bouffant type of shit. But as I understand it, the guy who there's two other guys that really sort of made The Simpsons what it is. There's this guy, Sam Simon, who... he didn't stay for very long because he was really hard to work with and people didn't like him, from what I understand. But he's the one that was like, we got to keep this grounded. We got to bring this down to earth. No fucking bunny ears and weird shit. No cartoon nonsense. No weird, wacky, stretchy Looney Tunes stuff. This has to be like real life. And it has to be mean. Comedy's only funny when it hurts someone. So he brought that in. Then there was James L. Brooks, who directed a bunch of very schmaltzy movies, but he was the one kind of credited with bringing in the actual family dynamic of like, let's make this a real family and let's make this a real neighborhood. So you have Sam Simon being the hard ass, James L. Brooks being the schmaltzy sentimental guy, and Matt Groening just being the weird, let's make overbites and yellow skin guy. You mix these all together, somehow you get this show. And then like the writers were all like Harvard grad, fancy pants, smarty pants fucking people. Like, I don't know how else to describe it. They're total nerds. But it all worked together to make this show. And they would, like I said, they worked like crazy and just put tons of work into these shows. Like, they really just felt like they had something to say, something to prove, something to like, let's show the world how great this can be. And they changed showrunners every year or two just to keep things fresh, keep things going. Where at this point, again, it's hard to say exactly when it happened. It was just a slow shift. So I always say the first 10 years are good, but most people say it's more like the first 8 years were good. But you can get up to like the first 12. It's still worth watching. But at some point, they only have one showrunner now, just one person who's been running it for fucking a million years, that is just, because it'll keep the fucking milling. And it's this worldwide show, so they need it to translate into all these different countries, where the early Simpsons just didn't. All those cultural references and all the complicated jokes just didn't translate well to other countries and other languages. And honestly, at this point, they just want to sell boxer shorts with Homer's face on it. That's all. That's all The Simpsons is now, is let's sell calendars. Like it's unbelievably bad nowadays. It's not funny, it's not clever. They literally like they explain the jokes. Something funny happens and then Lisa will say, "I can't believe the blah 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 happened." Like it's like a parody of itself. So we're definitely not talking about latter-day Simpsons. At this point, I wish it would just end. It's embarrassing. But those first 10 years, holy shit, crazy. So I didn't even it's not even like I got to look up top 10 lists or anything. You can pick any episodes. Of that whole first 10 years, there's like a handful of bad episodes. The rest are all good. So I figured, why not watch that one with the All in the Family opening? Because, hey, why not? Because, again, it doesn't matter. We'll just pick one. And then the other one I picked just at random, because it just came into my mind, is where Homer starts a union because he needs a dental plan for Lisa to get braces. And just because it's just these little Simpsons things float around in my brain. And there's just like Homer thinking, Lisa needs braces, dental plan. I don't know, it's just been in my head for 25 years. So I was like, hey, sure, why not? And that's a good example of these weird jokes that it's like I don't even know why they're funny necessarily, but that just stuck with me. Where in this episode, Lisa sings this revolution song about like the union and we can't back down against Mr. Burns. And then Lenny just goes, great, now play classical gas. So she just starts playing classical gas and he's just bopping around to it. And I don't know why that's so funny, but that's another example of like, that's the only reason I know the song Classical Gas. Why else would I know that song? And again, I haven't seen these specific episodes in a long time, but probably like 3 years ago, I just randomly started watching some old Simpsons and it's like, yeah, man, whew. Like we were talking about how stuff you see as a kid, is probably not as good as you thought it was when you grow up. These are, like I was saying, if anything, better. It's crazy how good these are.
Well, and probably you get the references more now than you would have when you were a kid. That just would have gone over your head, a whole lot of that stuff.
Yeah. So anyway, yeah, those episodes, if anyone wants to watch along. So first we're going to watch And Maggie Makes 3, which is Season 6, Episode 13 from January 1995. And Last Exit to Springfield, which was Season 4, Episode 17, March 1993.
Now, that's a takeoff on Last Exit to Brooklyn.
I don't, but doesn't surprise me.
Oh, yeah. That's a famous book from the late 50s, I think. I forget now who wrote it. It's got lots of filth and dirt and sex and all those things that would have been kind of taboo in the 1950s and becoming acceptable in the 1960s, but that book it's the late 50s. Last Exit to Brooklyn. It's quite a little eye-opener book from the 1950s.
Yeah, see, that's another example of, I just hadn't come across that book at any point.
At least I'm presuming that's what this is. I'll have to wait until I see it, but I'm presuming that's a reference to Last Exit to Brooklyn.
And and that's the Union one. So I mean, yeah, who knows? Again, it's like that'd be one of those time bombs just waiting. Like, were I to come across references to that book or ever read that book, then I would go like, oh shit, The Simpsons. Like that was, it's just been like, it's like a sleeper agent. It's like hidden in my brain all these years, and I don't know what I even know because of The Simpsons. There's so much stuff, it's ridiculous. And it's also funny. I think that's important to mention too, is it's not just, like let's stick our heads up our own butts and like just be too clever for anyone's good. It's also funny. But yeah, it's a shame that nowadays it is so
bland,
wildly unfunny. Yeah, just so bland. And yeah, even just if they would just stop explaining the jokes, that alone would help. But yeah, it's just funny that it was this pressure cooker of like, let's change the showrunners, let's bring in new people, let's outdo each other. That's not funny enough, we got to do this. That nowadays this guy's name is Al Jean, and I'm sure he's a nice man, but he's the one who's just been running the bland Simpson empire for easily 12 years now. It's been a long time. And he's obviously feeling no pressure. His only pressure is just keep pumping these out so we can sell coffee mugs. And it's just like, whew, that's a shame. Because I used to joke, back in the day, because man, like my whole generation was so obsessed with The Simpsons. Like they would play it once on CBC at like 5:30 and then twice on Fox between 6 and 7. So for like 5 of the 10 years, I'm going to say, of the 90s at least, me and all my friends were watching The Simpsons 3 times a day because it's better to watch a third episode of The Simpsons than anything else that was on TV. So it's like it was so yeah, and now it's just nothing. It's just like I stuck with it for a long fucking time, and it's like I can't anymore. I haven't watched it regularly in like a decade. Oh yeah, so I was gonna say, yeah. So I used to joke like, man, Simpsons is the greatest show. I hope it outlives me. And I don't feel that way anymore. It's like I can't believe this is still going. This is absurd. This fucking show won't stop. But in a way, that's a testament to its quality too. Is the first decade was so good that it can just coast on fumes for. I mean, it's been bad longer than it's been good at this point. And the only end in sight is if somebody dies, which surely is going to happen eventually because they're all getting old. You know, one of the voice actors, I mean, dies. You know. But all right, so first off, we'll watch the Maggie one, and Maggie Makes Three. Also, what a good theme song, right? Like once it pops up, it's that guy Danny Elfman. He did like Beetlejuice and stuff. He did that theme, and apparently he gets, I don't know what it is, like 10 cents or something every time they air The Simpsons. So he's made millions, millions and millions and millions because of this song.
Braces. And that's the tooth. Oops, I left the gas on.
So I realized I picked the wrong episode for that first one because that did not have the All in the Family gag. And that episode wasn't as good of the two. It was kind of domestic and it was just focused on Homer working at the bowling alley. Still an all right episode. But that other one, the second one, that's way more representative of The Simpsons, where they can jump around more and just all these weird, like, suddenly we're in Yellow Submarine, and then suddenly we're in Godfather Part 2 flashbacks, and like there were so many references in there. So that second one with the dental plan is much more what I think of when I think of old school Simpsons.
Both of them, though, but both had a lot of references in them.
Yeah, certainly not bad, but just like the second one, I think if I had only watched the one about Maggie being born, I'd be like, that's fine, that's all right. But then you watch the other one, and it's got like double the amount of stuff happening, and I'm like, yeah, there we go. That's that like, you know, where you just feel like you're getting overloaded with stuff. That's the kind of show, like that's why when we used to watch The Simpsons 3 times a day, that's why, because you could, so much crap in there. Just like, here's Dr. Seuss, here's even just the whoop, boop, 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 boop from the fucking Moe, Larry, and Curly. What are those guys called? The fucking
Larry, Moe, and Curly Joe. The Three Stooges.
Yeah, like that's yet another thing. Like I didn't know that's what that was till later, and then I'm like, just so many things.
Well, and there's things that you see that you don't know what they are, but you know that they are a reference to something.
Right.
So yeah, you could always investigate this thing up the yin yang. Like take a certain episode and say, what was the reference for that? Well, who was that? What was that? Because there were a few that most of them I picked up on, but there was the occasional one that I said, I know it's referring to something, but I don't know what it is.
Yeah, and then sometimes it could just be too, more of a general time or whatever. Like when they flash back to Burns' grandpa and the atom smashing thing. And I love how Burns is dressed in that little Victorian child outfit with his little curly hair and his giant lolly. But even that, like, as when that came out, I was like 13 years old or 14. I don't know shit about the world yet, but it's like priming me to have a sort of cynical view of the world where the kid is like, one day we're going to rise up and we'll form unions to stop you crooked, factory owners. Then we'll take it too far. Like it's all true. It's all, and it is all just, even just like if they had that episode ended with the classic sitcom, let's make a corny joke and everyone laughs as we go to credits. But I left the gas on. Like that's why everyone's laughing at this stupid joke. Because that happened in every single old school. So that probably happened 1,000 times in old sitcoms. So it's just nice to throw it in, but then twist it.
Yeah, they were good. Excellent. Good choice.
It's almost, it's just like, again, it's one of those things I almost don't know what else to say about it because, like I was saying at the start, especially that second of those two, but, you could easily delve into go dig up the wiki page and see what all the references were and discuss all of them and all the little connections and all the blah blah blahs. Or you could not and just say, "What? It's good ass show." Like it's almost too much. I love to even just the just like that. Even when it's not a direct thing, those visions of the past or whatever, like with the teeth. What would you do without the dental plan? And is this old-timey prospector man in his like overalls? Certainly wouldn't have old Champa here. And he's got the old-timey hip hop.
And the voice is Walter Brennan. We saw things with Walter Brennan in them. And I remember when we saw them, I couldn't remember his name. But then somehow we picked up something and we identified who he was.
Oh, I think I know. Yeah, like wasn't he in Green Acres or whatever?
Or Petticoat Junction or one of those.
Right.
But he was a famous actor from long before that, and we saw him in some of those early kind of cowboy shows that we saw. But oh yeah, that's Walter Brennan, the voice of Walter Brennan.
And what did you say in the first one when Homer and Marge are on the beach? From Here to Eternity?
From Here to Eternity, famous movie with Burt Lancaster and I think it's Deborah Carr is the female actress. But oh yeah, that rolling around on the beach with the waves coming in.
Yeah, so again, that's like another one of those, probably those time bomb things. I haven't seen that movie. It's one of those things I've heard the title. But if I ever did see it, obviously
you'd see that beach scene and you'd say, I've seen that beach scene before, but I haven't seen this movie. Like, where have I seen that?
Yeah.
Well, there's where you've seen it.
And of course, the reason that I know it and remember it is because that's where Homer deliberately puts sand in his pants because he likes how it feels, So, like, that's what the great thing about The Simpsons is. It doesn't matter if you don't know what that reference is, because you get the surface level joke that, Marge is like, homie, I've got sand in my pants. And then instead of that being, let's take our pants off, it's like, you're right, let's go home. But then the double joke is Homer likes the sand in his pants. But then the triple thing is that it's a reference that I didn't even know yet, that is just waiting to be unearthed someday. And yeah, I can see why it didn't keep up that level of density, especially like that one with the dental plan. Like that's a perfect example of just how much stuff they crammed into one episode was crazy. Obviously, you can't do that forever. The fact that they did it for like 8-10 years is pretty remarkable. But it's a shame that it feels like they don't try anymore. It'd be one thing if they were still trying to hit those heights and they just weren't able. But at some point, they just gave up the ghost and they're just like, whatever. Although one thing that's kind of funny too is there was a South Park where the whole joke was that every time they started a plot, they stopped because the Simpsons had already done it. Because at that point, the Simpsons had already had 300 episodes. And at this point, there must be 1,000 Simpsons. I don't know how many. There's like a lot. So that's not only a problem for other shows that the Simpsons already did every plot. It's got to be a problem for the Simpsons too, right? Like I remember there was one where Bart gets an elephant and they keep the elephant in the backyard and they're going broke trying to pay for this elephant. So then years later, an elephant shows up on the show and Bart's like, oh man, I wish I had an elephant. And Marge goes, you did have an elephant. His name was Stampy. You loved him. And Bart's just like, oh yeah. Because, all this shit happens and then next week it's just gone. It just resets. So they've done, and even one thing that is funny to think about that I didn't think of at the time till I read this somewhere is, they tried to keep the show relatively grounded, but there is that idea that every time you stretch it, you can't put it back. It's like crumpling up a piece of paper. You can't flatten it out again. So every time something cartoony and weird happens, the show is permanently more cartoony and weird, and you can't bring it back down to earth after a point. And, Homer gets a different job all the time, constant weird side jobs. He became an astronaut and went to outer space in season 5. Not season 15. Like that was an early episode where Homer was a world famous astronaut. How do you and it was a great episode, but how do you move on from there? How do you just pretend that didn't happen?
And then you end up back at the plant.
Yeah, every time, over and over. Yeah, like that's another joke Homer makes of just like, that's just the kind of guy I am this week. Like they did all this stuff. Then they started making the jokes about how they've done all this stuff. And then where do you go? Probably you should just get canceled like any respectable show gets canceled. But it's just that this show became a zombie and just never ended. So,
Yeah, I didn't realize they were still making them. I thought that what was on TV was reruns.
Yeah, just out of curiosity, just let me look up real quick just where we're at now. Because, at this point, I haven't watched Simpsons since I think the last time I really sat down and tried to watch it was like 2011, 2012, so 10 years ago at this point. But from what I hear, I do follow some people who still watch The Simpsons. There's this guy, Jay Hunter. He does a wrestling podcast called OSW Wrestling. He still watches The Simpsons. And every time someone goes like, oh, really? Like, is it worth it? He always says like, no. Like, I only do it because I feel honor bound. So season 34 is going on right now. There have been 734 episodes. So yeah, like I distinctly remember the 300th episode. I was still watching at that point. And yeah, so it's been over double that now. Quite a bit more than double that. And by 300, like it was getting to be, it wasn't great anymore. So to do another 300 on top of that is fucking ridiculous.
Yeah, and there's like a lot of shows that happens too. They just can't keep up the stamina.
Yeah.
It's like movies when you watch a remake after not remakes, but extension after extension. And you look back to the original, maybe one or two, and they're excellent. And then you look at these bland extensions, 10, 11, 12, and they're all awful. They're just awful. They have no depth to them.
So I guess with The Simpsons, it's similar, except with The Simpsons, since it's not live action. With The Simpsons, it's purely like an intellectual problem. They didn't feed the brain trust. They didn't bring in the right people. The right people aren't running it. I mean, I don't even know how you would. Like, I guess it was just this specific countercultural time in the 90s and these specific weird Harvard fucking smarty pantses, writing the show. Maybe, I don't know. I guess you just...
Well, see, yeah, you do have to have a certain brain set there. Obviously, those were people who were very much into not just producing a show, but researching it and getting all this data. I mean, that stuff just didn't come out of their pocket one day. They had to sit around and work on that and get all that information and then try to figure out how to put it together so that it would be palatable to the public. Now, if you don't have that kind of mindset, people who are willing to put in that time and effort and in doing all that research and then trying to make it all fit together, well, you're not going to have the same product.
It was also like a really specific worldview in some ways, like that with the episode where Homer worked at the bowling alley, the part where he's praying and he's praying to God and just saying like, hey, thanks, man, everything's perfect in my life. Don't change anything. So it's got that like he is praying, which again, you never see that on TV. Other characters don't do that. But at the same time, if you agree, give me no sign. Which is their sarcastic way of throwing in, by the way, there's no God and this is bullshit. But they don't just say that because that would be too harsh and too mean and not funny. So it's like the whole show is seeded with that feeling of like, here's what we think is nonsense. Here's what we think is dumb. But we're still going to address it and we're still going to put it in here and we're not going to be openly cynical about it, but it's in there. The whole DNA of that show early on is very cynical.
Yeah,
but
that's the key word right there. They are cynical and sarcastic.
Right.
And that's what pulls it off. And they don't just rub your face in it. They just make a comment and you either get it or you don't. And then they move on. And that's part of the success of it. If you don't get it, you can still enjoy it at the top level. But don't drill it into people's heads or faces or just insist that they get it. If they don't get it, well, they don't get it. But that's why you'd want to watch it a second time, because then you'll get more out of it. And a third time, you'll get more out of it. And that's the success of a good, whatever, show, novel, TV, movies, whatever.
It's funny too, right? The sort of gamut that it runs, where it's got like the sweet moments about like, oh, here's the pictures of Maggie at work because he's doing this job he doesn't like for his kid, and it's got that nice side. And then they throw in those little things where like Dr. Hibbert offers to buy the unborn baby for $60,000. That's super creepy. Like that's some black market shit. And like just what that suggests about him. Has he done this before? But they just move on. Or in the dental plan one with the flashback to Burns's grandpa, where they were saying like that kid who did nothing. They claimed he stole atoms, and they're like, we should have listened to that kid, but instead we walled him up in the abandoned coke oven. So dark, so creepy, like, but it runs the whole thing, and it's just is definitely a unique show. So it's one of those things like, I mean, I think you do have to be of my specific generation to feel the way I do about The Simpsons, because I grew up with it, you know? It was literally my teenage years were The Simpsons years. So, I mean, I don't think it can have the same impact for people that watch The Simpsons now because it's not the same show, or people who, you know, like when I was growing up, I'm sure you were, saw a lot of Simpsons in the background because we were always watching it, but it was just the show that was always on in the background.
I was too busy doing other things.
Right.
I actually enjoy watching The Simpsons more now that I have time to actually sit down and watch it from start to finish, rather than halfway through and you got to get up and go and do something, and then you're picking it up halfway through again. No, I didn't watch it that much when it was originally out. But I've watched quite a bit of it now as a much older person with more time to sit down and watch that stuff without interruption. And I gotta say, it's excellent.
Yeah, it's a little eerie now, too, that I was Bart's age when the show started, and now I'm older than Homer. But these things happen. But yeah, so that's where, I guess I'll just kind of finish off with this because it's such a grandiose statement. There's really nowhere to go from here. This is kind of ends the conversation, I guess. But to my generation specifically that grew up with The Simpsons, again, I know it can't really be seen this way by other people. But for us, for my generation, this is the best show that has ever been made. Like, there's a lot of good shows on TV, but to us, they're all fighting for second place because The Simpsons just had the depth of material, of stuff going on. Plus, it's just cool because it was a cartoon. That just makes it more timeless and more neat. And yeah, again, like at least 8 years, to me 10 or 12, that it was good. That's a crazy long run. Like, there's just nothing else that reaches those levels. But again, I do think you have to have been one of these kids who watched The Simpsons 3 times a day in the 90s to feel that way about it. It's just, yeah, I don't know. I don't know who would be listening to this that doesn't know about The Simpsons, but season 1 to 10, you could do worse. Then after that, you could almost not do worse. So.